There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a life when no one is paying attention. Not the quiet of peace, not the quiet of solitude chosen with intention. It is the quiet of a woman who has learned to need very little. Not because she has everything she wants, but because she has stopped wanting so loudly. It is the quiet of a Tuesday evening with the dishes done and the homework checked and the laundry folded, with nothing left to do except sit in the living room under the pale light of a lamp she bought 7 years ago at a clearance sale, and still means to replace, and wonder, in some distant and half-formed way, whether this is it. That was the quiet that surrounded Claire Ashworth on the evening of her 42nd birthday. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have looked from the outside like a crisis. She sat on the couch in her good jeans and ate a piece of toast with peanut butter because the children had eaten the leftover pasta she'd been quietly planning to have for dinner, and she didn't say anything because they were teenagers, and they were hungry, and you pick your battles. Her ex-husband's text had come at 11:47 that morning. "Happy birthday, Claire. Hope you have a good one." 12 words, 1 period, the digital equivalent of a handshake. Her daughter Maya, 17, had remembered at 6:30 when she came down for a glass of water. She'd said, "Oh, happy birthday, Mom," with the slightly guilty face of someone who has just recalled something they should have recalled earlier, and then she'd hugged her. A real hug, warm and smelling of lavender shampoo. And Claire had held on for exactly 1 beat longer than she meant to. Her son Eli, 15, had remembered at 8 o'clock when Maya apparently texted him from her bedroom, because he appeared in the doorway and said, "Happy birthday?" And then, after a pause, "Do we have any cereal?" There was no cake. There hadn't been one in 4 years, since the year after the divorce, when she'd made herself one, a small chocolate cake, boxed mix, and eaten 2 slices alone on a Saturday afternoon while watching a documentary about migratory birds, and cried so unexpectedly that she'd frightened herself. So she'd stopped. It was easier not to build a tradition than to watch it collapse every year. She sat with her toast and her phone and the lamp, and the house breathed around her. The refrigerator hummed. The radiator ticked. From upstairs came the thin, tinny sound of something playing through Maya's earbuds, just barely audible through the ceiling. And Claire Ashworth, 42 years old, did something she almost never allowed herself to do. She sat perfectly still and looked at her life. Not with despair. She was not a woman on the edge of anything dramatic. She was going to finish her toast and brush her teeth and set her alarm for 6:15 and start it all again tomorrow. But in this particular quiet, something in her chest shifted slightly, like a chair being moved an inch across a floor. And she had a thought so clear and unfamiliar that it almost surprised her out loud. She thought, "I have disappeared." Not in the way people disappear in movies. She still showed up. She showed up every single day, to work, to the school schedule, to the parent-teacher conferences, to the grocery store, to the slow bureaucratic grind of being the person who knew where everything was and when it ran out. She was present in all the logistical ways that mattered. She had simply, somewhere along the way, stopped being present in her own life in any other sense. She had become a person who enabled other people's lives while her own sat in the corner, like a coat she kept meaning to try on. She had been 42 years old for approximately 14 hours, and she was eating toast alone, and this was fine. Genuinely, practically fine. But something small and stubborn and not entirely defeated inside her thought, "This cannot be all of it." And then, because she was tired, she finished her toast, washed the plate, turned off the lamp, and went to bed. What she did not do in the weeks that followed was make a dramatic announcement. She carried the thought around with her the way you sometimes carry a stone in your pocket, reaching for it in quiet moments, turning it over, feeling its weight. She thought about it on her commute, 40 minutes by bus to the insurance firm where she'd worked for 9 years as a claims coordinator. She thought about it in the supermarket, holding a bunch of kale she kept buying and never eating. She thought about the version of herself that had existed before. Not nostalgically, not with the warm false glow of revisionism. She tried to be accurate. She had been, at 22, a person who signed up for things, who'd joined a pottery class and gotten genuinely good at it, who'd once, on a trip to Edinburgh, accepted an invitation from a stranger to go sea kayaking the following morning, and had done it, terrified and exhilarated, and remembered the cold water and the feeling of her own arms doing something competent for years afterward. Where had that person gone? She could trace the route. The years of building something with her husband, then the years of watching that something slowly come undone, then the years of putting herself back together in the most practical way possible, the way you put something back together when you're in a hurry and just need it to function. She had functioned. She had done a genuinely good job of functioning, but she'd been so focused on keeping everything moving that she'd shed things off herself one by one: leisure, spontaneity, the simple habit of wanting things for herself. One Saturday in early December, while the children were still in bed and the house was temporarily hers, she got out a notebook and wrote at the top of a page, in capital letters, "Things I would do if I were being brave." She wrote, "Learn to dance." She wrote, "Talk to the woman next door." She wrote, "Apply for the different job." She wrote, "Go somewhere by myself." She wrote, "Go on a date." She stopped and looked at that last one for a while. Then she drew a small box next to each one. The list wasn't long. It wasn't a bucket list. No skydiving, no northern lights. These were ordinary human things that ordinary humans did all the time. The fact that she'd written them down as if they required planning and courage and their own notebook page said everything about how far she had drifted. She looked at the list and thought about 22-year-old Claire getting into the kayak. She thought 1 year. She closed the notebook and went upstairs to check if there was coffee left in the pot. She told one person, her colleague Pamela, who was 56 and had already done something similar. Her version had involved a pottery wheel and a trip to New Mexico and a brief and educational period of dating someone entirely unsuitable. Pamela listened to Claire's halting explanation over lunch at the cafe near the office with the expression of someone who has been waiting years for this particular conversation. "Finally," said Pamela, around a spoonful of yogurt. "I haven't done anything yet," said Claire. "I know, but finally you're thinking about it." Claire poked at her soup. "It feels self-indulgent, like I should be focusing on the kids or the job." "Claire," said Pamela. "What?" "You just described a birthday where you ate toast alone, and your ex-husband sent you 12 words, and you didn't even have a cake." "I didn't want a cake." "You cried at the migratory bird documentary." "That was 4 years ago." "And we have talked about it," said Pamela, "every November since." Claire was quiet. "Sign up for the dance class," Pamela said. "The salsa one at the community center. I've seen you walk past that flyer." "I'd be terrible at it." "Of course you would. You're a beginner." Claire looked out the cafe window at the December street. Bare branches, flat light, people hunched against the cold. "I'll think about it," she said. "Don't think," said Pamela. "Sign up." She did not sign up that night. She opened the community center website, navigated to the registration form, had it open in a tab for 45 minutes while she helped Eli with a history essay, and then closed the laptop and told herself she'd do it tomorrow. She did it the day after tomorrow. Then it was done. She had paid £6 per session for 6 weeks of beginner salsa, and she felt both proud of herself and inexplicably like she was about to be sick. The first class was on a Thursday in January. She wore dark jeans and a dark top, on the theory that dark colors were less visible, which she knew was not how visibility worked, but which felt emotionally true. The instructor was a small, energetic man named Marco who spoke very quickly and used his hands constantly and had the quality of someone who found joy in other people's clumsiness rather than impatience with it. He was not unkind. He was also very direct about when you were doing something wrong. No, he said, appearing at her elbow. Left foot first. You are doing right foot. I thought... Left. She did left. Her body did not particularly agree with the counting. There was a disconnect somewhere between the number that came out of her mouth and the foot that was supposed to move. And for the first 20 minutes, she lurched around her small square of floor like someone trying to walk on a ship in rough weather. A young woman in a red skirt was already moving with something like fluency. The man in his 50s across the room had given up on the count entirely and was simply swaying, which Marco had not yet addressed. When the hour was over, Claire went outside into the January cold and stood under the streetlight and thought, well, I did not die. She walked to the bus stop. Her legs ached slightly, a low burn in her calves she hadn't felt in years. She stood in the cold and looked at the night, and she was tired and slightly humiliated in a way she hadn't been in a long time. And she thought, I'm going back next week. The thought surprised her. She had expected to hate it so thoroughly that the only interesting question would be how elegantly she could abandon it. But she didn't hate it. She had been bad at it, genuinely, unglamorously bad. And somewhere in the badness there had been something that felt like participation, like being in the thing rather than watching from the edge. She got on the bus. She texted Pamela, survived the dance class. Pamela replied, obviously. Same time next week? Claire put her phone in her pocket and looked out the window at the winter streets. She sat up slightly straighter than she usually did. She didn't know she was doing it. Her neighbor's name was Rosalind. She knew this from occasional parcels left in her porch for safekeeping. A woman somewhere in her mid-60s, with very short silver hair and a particular briskness of movement that suggested she had things to do and was proceeding with them. She had the herb garden Claire had written about on her list. Rosemary, thyme, something that smelled faintly of aniseed. Claire had said hello over the fence perhaps 6 times in 2 years. This was standard. This was how neighbors operated in the specific English combination of consideration and reserve that prevented anyone from ever meaningfully meeting the people who lived 8 feet away. She had been grateful for it in the worst years after the divorce, but she did not feel that way anymore. Or rather, she was trying to feel something different. On a Sunday afternoon in late January, she saw Rosalind in her garden doing something purposeful with a trowel despite the cold. Claire stood very still for about 30 seconds. Then she put on her coat, went out the back door, and stood at the fence. "Hello," she said. "Hello. I'm Claire from next door." "I know. You've taken in several parcels for me." "Yes, I was going to make coffee," Claire said. The next part came out with more momentum than she'd planned, as if her mouth had decided to get ahead of her fear. "If you'd like to come in?" "I'd love to," said Rosalind easily without ceremony. Claire blinked. She had anticipated more friction. She had built up in her head a whole apparatus of polite refusal that she would have to navigate, and instead, Rosalind had just said yes. Rosalind sat at the kitchen table with both hands around a mug and talked with great intelligence and occasional sharpness for an hour and a half. Claire learned that she was a retired architect who had spent 20 years in Scandinavia, that she'd been widowed 11 years ago, and made a decision afterward, as she put it, to only do things I actually want to do, that she had 3 adult children who called dutifully, and that the best thing she had ever made was a small library in Helsinki that won an award and still lived in her perfectly. Claire talked too, more than she'd expected. The children, the job, the neighborhood, the garden she kept meaning to do something with. She had not talked easily with a new person in a very long time. Rosalind left at 4 o'clock. At the door she said, "Same time next week?" as if she was already expecting the answer. "I'd like that," said Claire. She stood at the kitchen window for a while after. The afternoon was blue and cold, and the herb garden was ragged in the January light, and she thought, I almost didn't knock. She thought about how close the margin was between a thing you do and a thing you almost did, and how differently the afternoon had unfolded because she went out the door instead of watching through the window. In February, she applied for a job, a communications coordinator role at a small environmental charity, writing content, managing their external voice. Not a drastic reinvention. She had exactly the skills. She'd been able to write since she was young, and 9 years of insurance had made her quietly excellent at conveying complex information clearly. But the insurance firm was safe, known. She had a reputation there. The charity paid slightly less for the first year. She had talked herself out of applying every time the listing appeared. She sent the application on a Tuesday evening while the children did their homework. She did it quickly, before she could change her mind. The way you're supposed to rip a plaster off. She pressed send and sat very still and said out loud to nobody, "Okay, fine, it's done." The interview came 6 weeks later. She wore a dark blue blazer she'd bought years ago and barely worn, and she spent 10 minutes that morning standing in front of the bathroom mirror saying things to her own face, which she'd read was supposed to help with confidence and which felt, in practice, completely insane. She said, "You know what you're doing," to her reflection. Her reflection looked back at her with an expression she could only describe as politely skeptical. The interview was at a converted warehouse near the river. There were 2 interviewers. When the woman named Diane asked why she wanted to leave the insurance firm after 9 years, Claire said, honestly, "I think I've been choosing safety over development for a while, and I'm trying to do that less." Diane wrote something in her notebook. Claire couldn't tell if it was good or bad, and she decided it didn't matter because it was true. She walked out into the March afternoon with the river choppy and dark under a brisk sky, and she thought, I gave them the actual me. Not the best version of me, not the carefully managed presenting self, just the actual person. She didn't know if it was enough. She thought it was probably enough. She got the job in April. The email arrived on a Thursday afternoon while she was formatting a claims report. She read it twice on her phone, under the desk, then went to the bathroom and stood in a cubicle for a few minutes, breathing. Then she washed her hands and looked at herself in the mirror and said nothing because everything she thought of to say felt too small or too large for the occasion. She gave notice that same afternoon before she could talk herself back into safety. May, and the thing she had been most afraid of. She went on a date. It had been set up by Pamela, who was unstoppably and without apology a person who arranged things. The man's name was David. He was 47, a secondary school history teacher, Divorced for 3 years, 2 children a little older than hers. Pamela described him as solid. Funny in a quiet way, not a project. Claire said yes. She said it and immediately wanted to unsay it. She spent the following week in a state of low-grade anxiety that she managed mostly by being very busy at the new job and trying not to think about it. She had not been on a date since before she was married. She had been 26 when she met her ex-husband. For nearly 16 years, she had been part of a unit, and then, for 4 years, a person reconstructing herself, and not once in any of that time had she sat across a table from someone new with the specific exposure of romantic possibility. David was not what she expected. He was tall and slightly rumpled in the way of people who dress thoughtfully, but are always slightly undone by the end of the day. He apologized for being 4 minutes late, not elaborately, just sincerely. He had a quality of attention that felt genuine rather than performed. He listened to things without immediately waiting to respond. They talked for 2.5 hours. She told him about the job change. He talked about teaching, about the particular difficulty and unexpected reward of getting 15-year-olds interested in the past. He told a story about a student who had once asked, with genuine curiosity, whether Marie Antoinette had been good at sports. It was not a remarkable story. It made her laugh in a way she hadn't expected. She did not feel a thunderclap. She felt approximately like she was sitting across from a person who was genuinely interesting and seemed to find her genuinely interesting back. And that was both simpler and stranger than anything she'd built up in her imagination. He asked if she wanted to do it again. She said yes, with a full second's pause, choosing it with intention rather than momentum. She walked home in the May dark, the city still lightly warm, and felt something that took most of the walk to name. Not happiness exactly, something more like possibility, the texture of a door that wasn't yet open, but might be. She texted Pamela at 11. It was good. Pamela replied, I know. She did not fall in love with David. This is worth saying clearly, because there is a tendency in stories about women who begin to live again to have a man arrive at a pivotal moment like a reward. David was not that. He was a person she genuinely liked and genuinely enjoyed, and then someone she liked less as she got to know certain corners of him that didn't sit easily with certain corners of her, and then mutually and without drama. Not someone she was dating anymore. He was kind about it. She was kind about it. She was not devastated. She sat with the ending for a few days and found, when she was honest, disappointment, real and genuine, and underneath it, something she hadn't expected. Something like respect for herself, for having been in the thing, for having let herself want something, for not having protected herself out of the risk entirely. She had been in it, and it had ended, and she was still standing, still herself, no less whole than she'd been before. This felt like information. She told Rosalind, who nodded and said, disappointing, but not a disaster. No, said Claire, not a disaster. Good, said Rosalind, and poured more coffee. The open mic night was Eli's fault, in a roundabout way. She had been helping him with a school project on stand-up comedy and the history of social commentary, and they'd spent an evening watching old clips online, and she had found herself laughing more than she had in a very long time at the sharp, specific kind of comedy that doesn't need a punchline so much as it needs a recognition. Yes, that is exactly the thing I have also experienced and never said out loud. Sometime around 10 o'clock, she'd said out loud, I think I could do that. He'd looked at her. Do what? Stand up. Not professionally, but the thing where you talk about your life and make it funny. He'd looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Okay," he said, in the tone of someone reserving judgment. She meant it only half seriously, but the thought lodged. She'd always been able to make Pamela laugh. She'd always had a dry, slightly sideways way of looking at things, a quality she'd had since she was young that had been so rarely exercised in the years of survival mode that she'd almost forgotten it was there. She'd been funny. She knew it, once. She found an open mic night at a pub in the neighborhood, monthly, beginner-friendly, run by a woman named Lou, whose explicit goal was getting people to try things rather than to showcase polish. She signed up for the August slot at midnight, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine, because it seemed like the kind of decision that shouldn't be made in full sobriety or full sleep, but in that liminal zone where bravery and foolishness are most usefully confused. Then she spent 6 weeks being quietly, completely horrified with herself. She wrote material. She rewrote it. She sat in the car during her lunch hour and said things out loud to the dashboard. She had 4 minutes. 4 minutes sounded like nothing, until you tried to write 4 coherent, funny minutes about your own life and discovered that what's funny in your head is not always funny when spoken, and that the gap between the two was vast and slightly humiliating. Maya found her in the living room one evening, speaking to the wall. "What are you doing?" Maya said, in the specific tone of a teenager who has walked in on her parent doing something she'd prefer not to have seen. "Practicing. I'm doing an open mic night." The pause that followed was of a length and quality Claire was almost certain she had never produced herself, even in her most stunned moments. "Are you joking?" said Maya. "Ironically, no." Maya stood in the doorway with an expression trying to land somewhere appropriate. Then, "Can I come?" "Absolutely not," said Claire. August, a Sunday. The pub was warmly lit and smelled of beer and expectation. 12 people on the list. The audience was about 40. A supportive crowd, the specific warmth of people who had come to watch beginners try things and were rooting, collectively, for everyone. She sat with a glass of wine and watched the first 3 acts. The first was a young man, genuinely nervous, material about dating apps. The second was a woman whose material wasn't quite landing. Claire watched with her chest tight, knowing that uncomfortable feeling of a gap between what you hoped and what is happening. The third had clearly done this before, and had a polished ease that made Claire feel the opposite of reassured. Her name was called Seventh. She walked to the microphone and looked out at the 40 people looking back at her, and for exactly 3 seconds, she could not think of a single thing she was supposed to say. Then she said, "I am 42, which I've recently discovered is the age at which you start talking to your own reflection in the bathroom mirror to prepare for job interviews." A pause. My reflection, by the way, did not look convinced. A laugh, not a huge laugh, a genuine one. She kept going. She talked about the salsa class and about being the specific kind of bad at something that makes you understand why people give up. She talked about her neighbor, carefully unnamed. She talked about the open mic sign-up itself and about the difference between bravery and stupidity, which she described as almost impossible to distinguish from the inside. She got a laugh on the Maya line. She got a laugh at the end. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. She walked back to her seat and her hands were shaking slightly. Lou put a hand on her arm and said, "That was lovely," in a tone that sounded like she meant it. Afterwards, 2 people came up to her. A man who said, "The reflection bit was brilliant." A woman who said she was thinking of signing up herself and asked if it was terrifying. Claire said, "Yes." And the woman laughed and walked away, looking thoughtful. She walked home through the August warmth, the city looser and more generous in the heat, and she thought about the 3-second silence at the microphone. She thought, I was in that silence, and I came out the other side. She thought about the salsa steps she'd kept getting wrong and kept doing anyway. The fence she'd almost not knocked on. The bathroom stall in March. The Tuesday evening she'd pressed send before she could stop herself. The things on the list weren't the point. The point was the doing of them. The small, insistent act of choosing the thing that scared her slightly over the thing that required nothing. The accumulation of small evidence that she was still there. There was a moment in September she would come back to for a long time. She was at a literacy program she'd started volunteering at on Saturday mornings. Adults in their 30s and 40s who had slipped through school with gaps that had never been addressed. She was sitting across from a woman named Deborah, 38, who had been coming for 2 months and was making remarkable progress. They were working on a reading comprehension passage about the ocean. Deborah finished it and looked up and said, in her careful, measured way, I read that myself. Not with triumph. With something quieter. A kind of taking stock. Claire looked at her and thought, yes, that specific quality of seeing yourself doing the thing, not celebrating that you've done it. Just this clear, dry, honest acknowledgement. I did that myself. She thought about her bathroom mirror. She thought about the salsa steps. She thought about the Tuesday evening she pressed send. She thought, I did that myself. On the walk home, she thought about what the year had actually been. Not a transformation, not a resurrection. She was wary of those words. They promised something more cinematic than the truth. The truth was smaller and more durable. She had developed a practice of choosing herself occasionally, of treating herself as a participant in her own life rather than an administrator of other people's. She had done this badly, inconsistently, with missteps and retreats, and moments of pure cowardice she'd had to talk herself back from. She had gone to the dance class and been mortifying and kept going. She had knocked on Rosalind's door. She had sent the application. She had gone on the date and let herself want something and handled the ending without collapse. She had stood at a microphone for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. None of it had fixed anything. The loneliness was still there on certain evenings. It would likely always be there to some degree because the loneliness she felt was not the loneliness of being without people, but of being the specific person she was, in a world that does not always have room for you. She had not solved her finances or her children or the fundamental reality of building a life alone in a way she had not planned. What she had done was change the quality of the quiet. The quiet in her house on a November evening was not the same quiet it had been a year ago. It had things in it now. Rosalind's voice, the beat of salsa, the memory of 40 people laughing, a Saturday morning room smelling of carpet and possibility. The quiet had herself in it, more fully, more honestly. The quiet had stopped being the quiet of disappearance. The lamp was still there on the evening of her 43rd birthday. Maya made a cake. Not a beautiful cake. The icing had a slightly geological quality, suggesting it had been applied under time pressure. But a real chocolate cake, with candles, carried to the living room while Claire was reading. Eli came downstairs. The three of them stood together in the lamplight. "Happy birthday, Mom," said Maya. She didn't say it the way she'd said it last year, the guilty rush of someone who has remembered too late. She said it directly, looking at her mother, with the expression of someone making a point of saying it. Claire looked at the cake. She looked at Maya's face, then Eli's, which had the slight sheepishness of a 15-year-old participating in something tender. "Thank you," she said. "This is really... thank you." She blew out the candles. She did not wish for anything in particular. She thought, I'm here. She thought, I showed up for myself, and some of that showed up for them. They watched something on television, the three of them. Something mildly comedic they'd seen before. And outside the November night did its November things, and the lamp cast its steady, slightly yellow light. And Claire sat in the middle of her couch between her children and thought about nothing in particular. At 9:30, Eli went upstairs. At 10, Maya drifted toward bed and paused in the doorway. Night, Mom. Night. The open mic thing, Maya said. It was weird. But also kind of good weird. Claire looked at her. You came? Eli told me which pub. We stood at the back. Claire thought about this. Her children, standing at the back of a pub, watching her stand at a microphone for 4 minutes and 11 seconds, talking about her own life. She thought about how she would have felt about that a year ago. The mortification, the exposure. She found that she didn't feel that way now. She felt something warm and complicated. Something like, let them see me trying. Was it embarrassing? She said. Maya considered. The reflection part was actually funny, she said, which was not a direct answer, but was better than one. She went upstairs. The house settled. The lamp kept its counsel. Claire sat alone on the couch. This time, the quiet was hers entirely. The particular quiet of a woman who has spent a year choosing herself, imperfectly and often awkwardly, and finding out that she was still there. Still with things she wanted. Still capable of walking toward them, even when her hands were shaking and her steps were wrong and the count was off. She thought she might get out the notebook tomorrow and write a new page. Not the same list. Something different. Something that reflected who she was now, which was different enough from who she was a year ago that it warranted new paper. She turned off the lamp. In the dark, she sat for a moment, and the house breathed around her, and she thought, I am still here. I was always still here. She thought about the woman on the bus in January, sitting up slightly straighter. She thought about herself in the kayak, 20 years younger, getting in because she'd said yes. She thought, keep saying yes, not to everything, not to exhaustion or to the things that diminished her, but to the things at the edge of her comfort, the things that asked something of her, the things she might come home from with shaking hands and a story to tell. To those things, yes. To the version of herself that was still curious, still capable, still worth asking. She got up. She washed the cake plates. She set her alarm for 6:15. She went upstairs, past Eli's door, a blue light under the crack, and past Maya's, music very softly, the familiar lavender smell, and stood for a moment in the hallway of the house she was building, slowly and imperfectly, into a life she was choosing to live. She thought, I have a job I believe in, a friend across the fence, a salsa step. I mostly do right. Children who stood at the back of a pub to watch me. She thought, it will do. It will more than do. She went to bed. Outside the window, the November dark did what it always did. She lay in it and let her eyes close and did not dream of any other life. This one was enough. This one, she had finally decided, was hers. The year she decided to say yes to everything did not end with a parade. It ended with a piece of chocolate cake on a Tuesday evening, and a lamp that was fine, and the sound of her children breathing in their rooms, and a woman who had learned, over the course of 12 months and many ridiculous attempts, to believe she was still worth the trying. That was all. That was everything.